guess this has been a remarkable, as everyone in the room will testify, a remarkable 2 decades for the brain, for our understanding of the brain, our understanding of the mind. And I guess I just wanted to start with this question. You know, neuroscientists will say, well, the mind is the brain, and yet we still, in popular parlance, talk about the mind and the brain being something distinct. So I want to do a little thought experiment and imagine you had to describe the human mind to a Martian.
Well,
Rama.
we could talk about this for the next 3 weeks. Even that's not suffice. A lifetime will not suffice, I think. There are 3, broadly speaking, when you don't want to get bogged down in definitions. What is the mind? Like asking what is the world or what is existence? You won't get anywhere. But crudely speaking, there are, I think, 3 different questions embedded in that one question. 3 different approaches. One is the whole metaphysical question of what do you mean by mind? Here's this lump of flesh, but here's this wonderful experience of the universe that you're experiencing, the physical universe, so-called physical universe. How does that come about? This is a metaphysical question, a philosophical question. How does the activity of little wisps of jelly create my sensation of blue or red? I mean, all there is in my head, in my brain, is little specks of protoplasm firing away, flux of ion channels, and I'm experiencing red. How does that come about? Now, some people would argue is a philosophical question. Same thing with the nature of the self. What is the self? There is the philosophical question. What do you mean by the self? Who am I? And then there is the question that comes from introspection, from the Eastern introspective traditions. Exploring, going into your own self and exploring, doing science, or you can develop a science of introspection, so to speak. And this has been the mainstay of Eastern philosophical traditions for 4,000 or 5,000 years, since the time of the Upanishads.
Indeed. And
of course in Buddhism. The third is the empirical question of what do you mean by the self? Am I going on too long?
No, well, I mean, in other words, the mind is many things depending on your perspective.
That's right. Now, the empirical question is, as a scientist, one thing which I study is you think of the self as one monolithic entity, but in fact, there are many components. You've got your bodily self, sense of being anchored in a body. When you think of the self, you think of many things, many components. One is your sense of embodiment, so the embodied self. The other is a sense of passage of time, that you see yourself as a trajectory through space and time. The other is the unity of self, the sense of unity, that despite a bewildering blitz of sensory and cognitive information in your brain, all your thoughts and emotions, your passions and feelings, you feel like you're one person experiencing all this, so that's a unity of self. Then there is the sense of continuity in time. So all of these different components can get messed up in different mental disorders and in neurological dysfunction. So you can begin to understand how each of these components arises based on the activity of nerve cells in the brain. And then maybe put it all together and understand how self works empirically. That doesn't solve the philosophical problem of what the self is, nor does it get into the Eastern introspective tradition, which I'd like to hear from you more about.
Yes, I mean, Alan, many neuroscientists I've spoken to over the years get very cross that you would ever deign to distinguish between the mind and the brain. And I guess in this session here today, we want to talk about the way in which the mind influences the brain. But then neuroscientists would often tell me, well, that's just a silly question because the mind is the brain. How do you come at this?
Well, I think the studies on neuroplasticity themselves, such studies, show that our subjective experience does unequivocally, I think indubitably, influence brain function. I don't see how one can really avoid that conclusion. We'll perhaps talk about the placebo effect later on. But I think it's a methodological issue, and that is, I'll go back to the statement by William James, for the moment what we attend to is reality. If one's entire approach to understanding the mind is understanding it by way of physiological processes, by way of behavior, by way of brain, then of course people would be upset because you're stepping outside of the methodology or methodolatry, as whichever way like to look at it. And so I think Rama and I think we share quite a number of points in common. And one of them is that there is no one methodology that is going to provide us with all the answers about the mind, the brain, or their interaction. I don't think there's any one methodology, not the methodology of neuroscience, but also this largely unexplored in the modern world approach to really probing into the nature of the mind and processes within the mind from a first-person perspective, but not leaving it at the folk psychological level of just untrained introspection. Because in a way that was already tried. It was tried 135 years ago, and it pretty much died in 1910 introspectionism as a movement, as a scientific venture, collapsed, and it was replaced by behavioral psychology to a very large extent. But that's because they were all amateurs. There was no rigorous training, and of course, Eurocentric science at that time was especially ethnocentric. If we don't know it, nobody knows it. And happily now, 100, 125, 35 years later, here's Professor Ramachandran speaking from an education that is so bicultural. I mean, it's rooted in India, and yet, as I just learned this afternoon, trained at Cambridge, has taught at Caltech, UCSD, but nevertheless, Indian background. My first 20 years in the West, but then immersion into Asian culture. So the point here, simply put, is that if we approach the understanding of the mind from multiple perspectives, this is bound to be the richest approach. Approaching it by way of behavioral effects, expressions of the mind, behavioral psychology, Paul Ekman's work of studying the facial expressions and so on. Studying the mind by way of its neural correlates, very, very valuable. You're not going to get much information in terms of introspection. But as William James suggested, as a brilliant mind, multifaceted mind, first, foremost, and always, in his view, is actually observe the phenomena themselves. And if the mind, if we're going to use that word to this rich array of subjective experience, including attention, perception, dreams, visual, perception of all kinds, and so on, then why not develop rigorous ways to observe it directly, like every other branch of science directly observes the phenomena it's trying to understand.
And that's been the great interest in putting monks and seasoned meditators under brain scans, I guess, hasn't it? Rama, you describe we Homo sapiens, just considering what makes human nature unique, which is also the challenge that they've presented to us to discuss today. But you've described us in a wonderful way as the ape that looked into our own mind and saw the whole cosmos reflected inside. Describe that for us, if you can. Take on the cosmos. But that lovely description really was about you saying we are distinct from other brains, yes, other minds.
Well, one thing that strikes me as extraordinary is lots of things that are distinctive about us, like we have a sense of humor. Most hyenas laugh, but they don't have a sense of humor. And apes apparently, when tickled, make funny noises, but it's not clear they have a sense of humor. Indeed, not all humans have a sense of humor. I won't mention particular groups or countries, but...
Go on. No.
How did we get onto this? Oh yeah, one thing that certainly makes us human, which is very odd, is the need to be more than merely human. I don't know if it's true of everybody, but most of us have the sense of being, everything that science tells us is that we are actually glorified apes trapped inside the bodies of humans, right? We're perpetually trying to reach for the stars, and I think any ape can reach for a banana, but only a human can reach for the stars, so to speak. And this need for transcendence, ironically, transcending your mortal frame is uniquely human, I think.
Which would mean that you, as a neuroscientist, would understand the kind of metaphysical impulse that drives someone like Alan.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. But one thing that, going back to your question about neuroscientists getting annoyed about mind being different from brain, I think they're not alluding to the philosophical question of how you get sensations of red from little wisps of protoplasm in your brain. But the point that often is made is we're just looking at the brain and activity of cells. What can this tell us about any aspect of mental function? It's just a correlation. Well, science always begins with correlation. For example, if you say that tuberculosis, every time you look at the sputum of a patient with tuberculosis, you see the tubercle bacillus. That's how the bacillus was discovered. Rabies is caused by a virus. All antibiotics were tested simply by correlation. It's the first step where you begin, you would agree with that. And then you take the next step of showing that bacillus is actually involved in tuberculosis. So the same strategy is being applied to brain science. Correlation is not enough, but it's a good place to start if you want to understand brain function.
Alan, thinking about what you think makes us unique, in some sense it doesn't depart from what Rama's saying, because you have said, the Buddhist view would be that as humans, we are able to examine our own experience, to interrogate our own experience, and that too is what makes us unique. And that's, I guess, central to the Buddhist project, isn't it?
It certainly is, and just to touch lightly on the issue of correlation, it's certainly true what you said. At the same time, I think Galileo, who really started the scientific revolution from physics, I don't think he was so keenly focused on correlations, but actually what was innovated from him that was not there in Copernicus was very sophisticated ways of observing the phenomena that he was seeking to understand. And that it was multiple, because he did terrestrial physics as well as astronomy, but in both cases, very meticulous ways of observing, with sophistication, in replicable ways, that which he was seeking to understand. And when you're studying behavior, you're not observing mental events, and when you're studying the protoplasm inside the head, you're not observing mental events. And so therefore there is an approach that is not studying correlations, although they're extremely important, and that is the introspective. But it must be, if this is to ever enter into a full-scale collaboration with scientists, and not, as you were suggesting, or you alluded to, monks who are simply subjects, because they could have been guinea pigs. But monks who are not simply subjects for the research of other highly professionally trained people, but inviting contemplatives in a full-scale collaboration. But can they earn that status? And I would suggest, Rama has mentioned that there is this realm for 5,000 years in India of developing really professional expertise in the first-person direct observation of states of consciousness. And if there are any states of consciousness that are not contingent upon the brain, you won't get it by studying, you will never unveil those by studying brain activity or behavior. You would get it only by observing the depths of consciousness and see whether it too has multiple dimensions.
Well, thinking about what we can study, I mean, Rama, as you presented this morning, one of your great passions has been investigating a very select set of neurons, the mirror neurons. I guess it's one thing to take a set of neurons and say, well, they're involved in our ability to learn from each other, to imitate from each other, to appreciate the contents of other minds, to empathise with other people. It's another thing to say that they are kind of neurons that made civilization as we know it. And you have made that claim that they were responsible for the great cognitive leap forward.
Well,
are we reading too much into just a little set of neurons in our brains?
I think you're reading too much into it.
Am I? I got it all from you, though.
Well, I think the trouble is the press always engages in hyperbole, and the title of that chapter also was not chosen by me, The Great Leap Forward. It's certainly true that they're contributing to human civilization and culture, because the emergence of culture, one of the main things, of course, is imitation. For a polar bear to evolve a coat to fight the cold would have taken hundreds of thousands of generations, over 100,000 years. A human child watching its parent, mother, kill and skin a polar bear would have just taken one step, just watched it, and then put itself in the parent's shoes and emulate or imitate the behavior, and acquire through Lamarckian evolution in one step what would have taken a polar bear 1,000 generations or 100 generations to learn. So they played an important role, but that's not, one isn't saying that they're the only, once you understand mirror neurons, you understand civilization and culture. So that's the key point I'd like to make there.
You do make huge claims about these neurons, though, and what they might have triggered in us, how they might have triggered cultural evolution, and the fact that they I
would say that they may have played a role in triggering cultural evolution, but that's different from saying that they explain all of cultural evolution. I mean, this sort of thing always happens in science. When you make a statement, for example, if I say the discovery of DNA, Crick discovered DNA molecules, structure of DNA, genetic code, and he said, I discovered the secret of life. It was just hyperbole. We know now that it's partly true that DNA contains the secret of life, but one also knows that's not the whole story. It doesn't encompass all of biology. But it was a major discovery in the history of biology, history of ideas in science. So it'll be true for mirror neurons as well.
Alan, what do you make of the attempt to take an experience, a capacity like empathy?
Say again?
What do you make of the attempt to take an experience like empathy?
Empathy, yes.
A capacity like empathy, or the ability to sympathise with other people, empathise, and define that talent by a number of neurons in the brain.
I'm not sure that I'm going to...
Do you struggle with that?
Of course, I don't believe it. But I don't really hear Rama saying that. When he says conditioned by, playing a catalyzing, triggering, playing a contributing role, I think that's undeniable.
I think we agree.
I think so. I think so.
But one thing is that, I mean, Rama, you have said that mirror neurons offer a possible explanation, a partial explanation of how the inner self interacts with the world. Alan, I know that you're very interested in how does the world interact with the inner self, aren't you?
Certainly, yeah. But once again, I always come back to this theme of complementarity. As I was listening to Mike Mersnick speak this morning, I was just kind of feeling this resounding affirmation all the way through, that it was first-rate science, but it was so human-oriented to really help people in their own lives with disabilities, neurogenesis, and all of this kind of thing. And so when we're trying to understand empathy, if you're looking for a biological explanation of what are the neurocorrelates of empathy, well, don't go to the behaviorist or go to the Buddhist meditator. Go to people who really know their neuroscience inside and out. But then if you're asking, how do you cultivate empathy? Well, the Indian traditions, as well as the Christian contemplative and so forth, have thousands of years of experience of this, of how do you actually develop it? And what is the difference between empathy and compassion? Or are they simply the same? And they're not the same. So on the one hand, complementarity, but what I think is the real celebration of what's happening right now in the 21st century is it's not simply two tracks. There's a woman, Tanya Singer, who's now has found neurocorrelates of empathy and the distinctive neurocorrelates of compassion, having defined them clearly. We have Mike Merznick's work, which is attending to these subjective experiences, but bringing in the wisdom, the insight of neuroscience, but that does not deny or preclude the insight of first-person methodologies from the contemplative traditions and from psychology as well. So if we're always holding that balance, that no one perspective has the whole story, then we'll continue to learn from each other, and then everyone gets benefit.
Rama.
The only qualifying remark I would make is I'm completely agreeing with you on all of this, especially about behaviorism. But at least, even though we may debunk the more philosophical aspects of behaviorism, philosophical stance, that you should ignore introspection, at least it's lawful. The laws of behavior studied by Skinnerian conditioning and all of that.
Well, we should just convey to people what behaviorism is, I guess. This idea that we can't study inner states at all, that there's no point studying our internal mental states. All we can go on is our behaviour.
Right. But if you want to predict how exactly a rat's going to behave when you do intermittent reinforcement versus continuous reinforcement, you can make predictions. You can study it and make predictions about the behavior in exquisite detail. It's all very lawful and big tomes have been written about it. But it's lawful and it's science. It may be largely irrelevant to us as human beings, but it's lawful and it's science. Similarly, with introspective traditions, what's missing, in my view, is a rich tradition that's waiting to be mined, but it doesn't have the rigorous quality that behaviorism does yet. People are beginning to do that, but I'd like to hear more from you about what's being done to do that. There is no textbook of introspection, which has all the laws of introspection, and all the details, and all the graphs and measurements, saying here's a standard book for introspection, other than just touchy-feely stuff. Which is important, but that's not. Sure. We want just like the Skinnerian textbook of behaviorism, which is irrelevant to us humans, but is all lawful and scientific. We need a lawful scientific textbook of introspection.
Quite so.
Alan, there's your challenge.
There's my challenge.
I mean, I guess the whole movement for mindfulness-based meditation is an attempt to construct a framework around the impact of meditation, but that's not quite getting at what Rama's asking you at all, really. In
a way, I'm reminded of, was it Professor Doolittle in Why Can't Women Be a Little More Like Men? And so when you're studying something physical and objective, to then find quantifiable laws is then the scientific success. When you're studying things like emotion from the first-person perspective, which are by nature qualitative, and then to demand we need quantifiable laws, otherwise you're not enough like a man, I think maybe it's not so much parity. There needs to be a different set of criteria, but the point still holds. And this is what I find in the Asian traditions more so than I found in any Western tradition, let's say Abrahamic or Eurocentric civilization, and that is turning introspection and actual rigorous ways of investigating the mind-mental processes from a first-person perspective. You don't come up with quantifiable laws, but do you find regularities? Yeah. Regularities, and the answer from the Buddhist perspective is absolutely yes. That the claim here, but this is not to be accepted on blind faith, the claim is that by rigorous, sustained, introspective investigation, for example, of what are the true causes of suffering, because a catalyst may cause me to suffer, but not cause you to suffer. I might be totally content in solitude, you might be miserable, you might be very content, but qualitatively, can we find regularities, patterns, whether or not you can get a graph, but replicable observations that are legitimate discoveries. And I think this is the great complementarity that's waiting to happen. But then we have to have somewhat different criteria of what do we mean by laws, because it's not going to be as quantifiable as what you get by studying the physical.
Let's take an example and anchor it in an example that I think we've all had, and that is the placebo effect, where we think we're taking a medication, but it's actually not a medication, it's a dummy pill or something to that effect, and we get better. Now, I mean, how would you, Alan, this is of great interest to you, the placebo effect, because here we have potentially thoughts affecting a physical outcome, potentially, we don't know. How would you investigate the placebo effect? The mind itself might be a sort of therapeutic tool.
In the mind itself, again, to be more specific, because it's expectation, it's belief, it's trust, it's desire, it's hope. So those are some of the specific mental factors that are involved that may or may not, and this is where it gets tricky, may or may not induce the placebo effect, because it's not uniform. At the same time, when the placebo effect is working, it also can be very specific, and it can bring about neurophysiological changes in the brain comparable to those that are induced by taking a drug. And so it's a real physical, measurable effect by simply believing in something, right? Now, if it merely the belief simply made you feel better, then I would say, okay, then that's not so interesting. But in one case of a study in Parkinson's disease, people were given a dummy, and people taking it, of course, believing that they were getting cutting-edge medication, it actually caused the nerve fibers that produce dopamine to grow, and so they were producing more dopamine, and they were getting clear, measurable relief from the symptoms of Parkinson's because it was actually internally working. That was by a suggestion. So I find this is an area we should linger a little bit and not wash it over and say, well, that's merely a placebo. Let's get back to the real science. What drug can we develop and make money from? Because the placebo is not marketable. But the fact that...
But I mean, there have been some complementary medicine providers who have said, well, placebo effect is a legitimate effect. Well, buy our product on that basis.
Well, I think a lot of Asian medicine works this way, and they're not trying to fluff it. They're just saying that your belief, your confidence in the doctor, and so forth and so on, is part of the healing process. But what I find interesting here, that I think is sometimes glossed over, is the very specific expectation by a person who has no understanding of brain physiology, human physiology at all, the very specific expectation you have, this will help me with my Parkinson's, actually triggers exactly those neurophysiological processes in the body that bring about the desired effect. And I think one should linger there. If that's not true, then it should be clearly demonstrated we don't need to think about this anymore. But if it is true, then we need to pause. How is that possible, apart from alluding to sheer magic, that an uninformed belief that this will help alleviate my Parkinson's actually triggers exactly those mechanisms in the brain that are needed to bring about the desired result?
There is some dispute about whether belief is what's going on here, but how do you, Rama, see the placebo effect?
Well, I have two comments here. One is, and there's an extraordinary observation, I don't know who made this, but the claim is that placebos work even if you're told it's a placebo.
Yeah. Yes.
And to me, that's extraordinary.
If I can interject briefly, I know that's true because it was the Italian neuroscientist who's the world expert on placebo. He was told, so here's a man who's doing straight neurophysiology of it. He was told, Professor, this is a placebo. And then he takes it, and it still has the placebo effect. Right. And so it's not a rumor. It's from his laboratory. Right. So, back to you.
Rama, yeah. I mean, that is intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to tap into this potential for actually treating patients.
Well, I wonder whether the work that you've been doing with mirrors and people who have had an amputation is playing into the same possible impact, because this is about...
No, because the control for that is in fact the placebo, where you have a covered mirror, which does nothing. And the patient doesn't know which works and which doesn't work. And the second, you get two controls, two placebos. One is the covered mirror. The second placebo is visual imagery. Patient is told, intensely imagine the phantom is moving, that is known to cure pain. Maybe it'll cure your pain. We're doing some clinical trials. And the person who's evaluating the procedure is blind. He doesn't know which procedure works. The patient doesn't know which procedure works.
But I mean, if you've got a covered mirror, that's not really a placebo, is it?
Well,
because they're not going to think, well, that mirror's going to have an impact on me. I mean, this is about belief affecting experience, isn't it?
Well, most patients think the mirror is comical. You know, here's a guy who's been in pain for the last 10 years, tried morphine, tried all kinds of medications, sometimes tried surgery. None of that works, and the mirror works. Why would the mirror alone be a placebo and not morphine and surgery? Right? So the specificity of the effect is important.
Well, what do you think's going on in that exchange with the mirror when someone places their non-amputated hand in front of the mirror?
Well,
and so, I mean, what do you think is the mechanism that's going on that says, well, if I think that's my hand, then I will no longer experience the pain that is in my amputated limb?
Well, again, to emphasize, it doesn't involve thinking, but if you ask him to, without the mirror, if you ask him to think, Why don't you try move your arm? He gets irritated. He says, what do you think I've been doing the last 10 years?
Yeah.
He's irritated. The mirror can give us actual visual feedback, independent of whether he believes or not. Mirror gives him visual feedback, closes the loop, because one of the causes of pain is the discrepancy between the motor signals going out to the hand and the lack of visual feedback. The discrepancy itself is the source of pain. What you're doing by giving the mirror is restoring the loop visually, sensory motor loop. That seems to eliminate the pain in some cases. So it's nothing to do with his belief or not lack of belief.
All about the visual feedback.
That's correct.
Well,
Same thing with the RSD, reflex sympathetic dystrophy, the pain syndrome I described. There also, without the mirror, there is no relief from the pain. It's unrelenting pain. For years, and they've tried morphine, they've tried. In fact, I had a postdoctoral fellow who did this research, Eric Alshula. Somebody asked him, you're using the mirror to treat this RSD pain or stroke. What is the control? This is before he did the controls. He said, yeah, the controls have been done. It's called the rest of medicine. Because they've been trying to treat phantom pain for the last 30 years unsuccessfully. Why were they not placebos? Why only a mirror, Then, of course, he went on to do the placebo as well in a more rigorous manner.
Another area that's really interested me in how, whether we can train our mind to change our experience, change our brain, so to speak, has been in your work with people with autism. And this notion that, well, you've done the work on mirror neurons, you've observed that people with autism have a deficient mirror neuron system, so they can't empathise. They've lost that sort of mechanism to help empathise with others or read the contents of the minds of others.
Right.
But you did this really interesting, or you've proposed interesting work at least, on biofeedback. How would that work?
Well, the idea is that maybe the mirror neurons are involved briefly, just I already mentioned this morning. You find cells in the back of the brain which are sensory mirror neurons. If somebody touches me, the neuron fires. If I watch somebody else being touched, the neuron fires. There are also motor mirror neurons. So the neuron fires in my prefrontal cortex. When I wiggle my index finger, the neuron fires. But when I watch somebody else wiggling their index finger, the same neuron fires. So whatever center in the brain is reading those signals says, look, that monkey, that person is about to do the same thing as you would do if you wiggle your finger. So it's creating a virtual reality simulation, other person's brain, allowing you to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So it stands to reason that this is involved in modeling other people's minds, creating a virtual reality simulation of somebody else's mind, predicting their behavior. These are things which are diminished in autism. And pretend play, for example, involves me pretending I'm this action hero. This is also diminished in children with autism. Imitation is often deficient. So this led us to suggest that there may be a paucity of mirror neurons. But they're not completely gone, they may be dormant, in which case maybe you can stimulate, revive the function of these dormant neurons by some means, through some kind of feedback, biofeedback, to encourage them to get renewed in some way.
So how would that work? Would that involve...
Well, there is a group here in Australia, I'm blocking their name, I'm embarrassed to say, who have actually done transcranial magnetic stimulation of the mirror neuron system and showed some alleviation of symptoms in autism. Anybody here know which group this is?
It doesn't come to mind immediately. But is that getting, say, a young autistic person to, in a sense, train their mind? I mean, you can't sort of mechanically go work mirror neurons. You can maybe stimulate them to work. Yeah. But there's been another proposal that you can actually might be able to train the minds of these kids.
Well, one idea has been, my colleague Jamie Pineda has been studying this, which is where you take EEG signals, which are markers of autism, and see if you can get the young person to amplify those signals through biofeedback, thereby encouraging mirror neuron function.
By thinking. And then watching the signal.
Watching the signal, yes. There have been some encouraging results. I would say at this point, the evidence connecting mirror neurons to autism is suggestive but not conclusive yet. So more work is needed.
Alan, back to the placebo effect, because some have dismissed it outright and said, well, there's all sorts of possible explanations. It might be that if you allay a person's anxiety, you can dampen the stress response, which you can have, there are all sorts of explanations. Others have said, well, look, there's been no studies that have been adequately designed to investigate it. What mechanism do you think's at work? Do you have a hypothesis?
When you speak of mechanisms, then you're speaking of brain science, and I I would not even venture to start. But not in any company, because I'm simply not a brain scientist. But I do believe that the role of information here is really crucial, because we're told something. We're told something, if you take this, you can expect this outcome. And the role of information, we are after all in the information era. We're not living in late 19th century with mechanistic materialism, classical physics defining the entire universe. We really should have outgrown that by now. And so what is the nature of information? And there are some world-class physicists of the stature of Stephen Hawking, John Wheeler, Andre Linde, Anton Zeilinger, to name a few, that suggest that information just information itself, meaningful information, semantic information, may actually be very much in the very nature of reality itself and not simply an excretion, a product of protoplasm inside the head. If we understood, and this is John Wheeler suggesting that we view the entire universe not as fundamentally boiling down to matter and energy, but viewing the entire universe as a quantum system. It's called quantum cosmology, in which case our very categories of matter and energy are derivative of our perceptions, of our measurements, and what is primary is information. And the categories of space, time, matter, energy are all derivative of that, suggesting that the universe should be understood as an information processing system in which the role of the observer participant is absolutely fundamental. Macrocosm.
It's almost describing the universe as a brain.
Well, it's true. I'll just use his words. I mean, one could say, but then the brain is simply creative matter and energy. There's nothing more in there besides matter and energy. But they're saying matter and energy are derivative. Information is primary. And so there's a macrocosm, the universe, and of course this has not been demonstrated, but it's by some pretty top-notch thinkers, cutting-edge physics. So let us consider possibly as a microcosm of this, that a human being doesn't simply boil down to atoms in motion, which was the view of Richard Feynman, for example. But what would you expect? He's a physicist, so he's working with his strengths. But if the human system, a human being, can be understood more as an information processing system, conscious, then when I tell you, if I'm a doctor, a Harvard PhD doctor, and I tell you, if you take this, this will get you better, from my information system to your information system, I'm feeding you information, and that trickles out by way of the placebo effect, your expectation and belief, to trigger those specific physical mechanisms needed to bring about what you expect will take place. Bear in mind, though, there's a symmetry here. There's not only placebo effect, but there are many people in the United States, for example, who can't afford health insurance. So they go into the internet when they're feeling bad and they try to diagnose themselves.
And feel worse, yeah.
And then they falsely identify the disease they think they have, and then having done so, they start getting the symptoms of the disease that they believe they have. So it's tit for tat, placebo, nocebo. Please me, don't please me. So it works both ways. It's not just on the upside.
Rama, do you have some thoughts there? That's fairly cosmic.
Well, I don't want to step into the territory of quantum physics and all of that because I know very little about it. But one thing that struck me was your point about the specificity of the placebo response. That requires more careful investigation.
Yes.
Because it's important to show it's not just warm, fuzzy feeling making you feel good about everything, but very highly specific beliefs and expectations translating into brain events, which then cause you to respond in a very specific manner to whatever ailment you have, or whatever pain, or whatever you're suffering from.
Exactly.
That requires more empirical investigation, as you well know.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah. If it's not true, then let's just all know that it's not true. If it is true, then we need to really pause there and linger and investigate more deeply.
Absolutely.
Total agreement.
Thinking about brain plasticity, which has captured the world's imagination, not the least because of people like Norman Doidge writing books like The Brain That Can Change Itself. I just wonder sometimes whether, when I've broadcast about brain plasticity or done events like this about brain plasticity, you get queues of people very buoyed by the positive narrative about the brain and the fact that we can change it and that it's not fixed, and that, so you have people who have had strokes or have had experienced brain damage feeling very hopeful. But sometimes I wonder whether we've all oversold the message of brain plasticity over and above the evidence that's there. Rama?
Well, we used to think it was being oversold until the last 2 decades or 25 years, especially Mike Merzenich, who was one of the great pioneers in this field. Early on was a prophet in the wilderness at that time. But now it's widely accepted that, in fact, there's a tremendous amount of latent plasticity. This is what my whole lecture was about, Mike's lecture was about, in the human brain. So much so, you remember the diagram I showed you, the old model of the brain was isolated modules. And again, it's not a completely false view, Because in the early stages of information processing, there are modules in the brain. There's an area called V4 in the temporal lobes, visual
Part of
area.
our visual system.
Yes, which is specialized primarily for color. Another area for motion called MT, which is mainly the cells are sensitive to direction of motion. So there is a lot of modularity in the brain. But what's emerged in the last 20 years is a tremendous amount of plasticity of connections. Not within each module is not just hardwired. In fact, it's in a state of equilibrium with the environment, constantly changing its connections in response to environmental needs. It's in equilibrium with other modules like vision and touch and hearing. They're all interactive to a tremendous extent. And as I said, with the skin and guts and bones as an RSD, so the skin can affect what's going on in the brain can affect what's going on in the skin, and with other brains through mirror neuron system. This shows there's a tremendous potential, latent potential for change, so much so you can use a mirror visual feedback to change the skin and bones and reduce the atrophy of the skin and bones. And this is not mumbo-jumbo, touchy-feely science. It's been shown with controlled clinical trials that this is true. So I would say it's not been oversold. I think there's a lot of truth to it. But at the same time, we don't want to overstate it, since there are specialized regions of the brain. There's a visual cortex for vision, auditory cortex for hearing, and so on and so forth.
Yes. What's your take on that, Alan?
I'm just seeing mounds of possibility for collaborative research. And that is, if we look, as Buddhism is simply one example, and it's not unique, but it has its own unique strengths. But centuries upon centuries of very sophisticated means of training the mind in terms of cultivating empathy, compassion, loving kindness, cultivating attention, developing mindful skills, developing means of investigating the very nature of the mind, the true causes of suffering and of well-being. But there's a great deal of sophistication there. And that it's exactly that type of training that could be brought to bear to utilize neuroplasticity, to draw from its full potential. And so if we bring that together with this cutting-edge neuroscience, then we have what Mike Merzick presented this morning, and that is, I don't know how much his work draws on the contemplative, but it was certainly right next door, you know? And so if we're taking now, I think it's, to my mind, ethnocentricity should be treated like dinosaur. You know, it should be regarded as dead, embarrassing, or just anything else that's dead. We have to be beyond that. The challenges we're facing here as a global civilization are so deep, they're so powerful, and they're so urgent that I believe we really have to draw on the wisdom of multiple cultures and not have the notion that any one of them finally has the final say on any of these large issues.
Well, I'll get a final word from you, Rama, on that. I mean, you've been well and truly ensconced in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, but how do you see that? But you've reached well beyond that into the artistic realm and other realms in your own work. How do you see that interdisciplinarity? Because still, despite the talk, I often think there are still very firm silos around some of these stories about the mind.
Well, I think that going back to what we were saying about the science of introspection, and I think we both agree, Alan and I, that we need to make it a little bit more rigorous and more scientific, not quantitative necessarily, but more scientific, to use that term. And especially things like harmony in one's mindset, happiness, harmony, things like that, which have not really been adequately studied by reductionist neuroscientists. These things need to be done. And increasingly there's a growing, when I was a medical student 25 years ago, we were taught that there's Western science, Eastern traditions. Even though I was raised in India, I was raised in the Western mode, saying that, well, you know, those Eastern traditions are interesting, but they're esoteric and ancient, and maybe there's a grain of wisdom here and there, but not much more than that. I'm ashamed to say that was what I was raised on a steady diet of that. Now there's a growing realization that these two parallel universes can merge and live in harmony and draw insights from each other. That's what Alan has been doing all these years.
May I add a final note on this point? Something I find enormously inspiring, and it was triggered by a suggestion from me to the Dalai Lama, and then he took it and he made it go like supernova. And that is what we have in mind, and I'm working very closely with him at this point. I've been a student for more than 40 years, is a centre in Bangalore. A centre in Bangalore by his choice. I was thinking of Sikkim or something like more romantic in the Himalayas. But a deeply professionally contemplative centre for research, for people who are trained for months and years on end, to really turn introspection into a rigorous, replicable mode of penetrating investigation. where there would be multiple traditions. So Buddhist, Hindu, Jaina, Taoist, there could be Christian, there could be Sufi. Multiple contemplative traditions. But they must come with something really rigorous already, and then we're coming here to learn from each other. But in the same place, not just a contemplative, let's say, retreat center, but here in Bangalore, which is one of the hottest places in India, metaphorically speaking, in terms of science, entrepreneurship, and so forth, invite scientists to the table.
So where's that at?
It's right in south central India.
Yeah, so where is the
We're right
project
now
at?
we have now a superb executive board, mostly consisting of marvelous Indians, neuroscientists, and others, and then Paul Ekman, the psychologist, is on the board. I'm on the board. The Dalai Lama is really the visionary for all of this. But the idea is exactly what Rama just mentioned, and that is bring in cutting-edge science. Nothing less will do. Cutting-edge science from psychology, neuroscience, that we could bring in education for that matter, for applications, and then bring this together in full collaboration with professionally trained contemplatives. So it's not just the scientists studying the meditators, which is almost uniformly what's gone on thus far. And then the people writing the papers, the scientists and the meditators are anonymous. But rather bring in professionals to professionals. And the optimal would be if the contemplatives have some idea about modern science, and the scientists have maybe done a little bit of meditation, so they have some experience, some taste, that it's not just conceptual, full-scale collaboration. I think that has enormous potential for understanding the nature of the mind more deeply on multiple levels, but also for practical applications. How can we deliver something of genuine benefit in education, mental health, business, and, as we'll hear this afternoon, how about athletics? Might the mind be involved in athletics in any significant way?
Well, on that hopeful note, can I thank Vilinor Ramachandran and BL and Wallace. Thank you. And thank you.